I'll marry you if you can fix that. The words landed like a match tossed into a room full of expensive perfume and champagne. The laughter that followed was the kind that came easily to people who had never needed to earn anything bright, careless, and just cruel enough to sting. Every eye in the room turned toward the man standing near the fireplace, a worn leather toolbox resting at his feet, his expression as still as polished stone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dark-skinned, dressed in clean work clothes that looked entirely out of place among the tuxedos and evening gowns crowding the grand foyer of Carter Mansion. The woman who had spoken, Evelyn Carter, 35 years old, sole heir to a fortune that had taken 3 generations to build, stood at the center of the room with a champagne flute tilted at an angle that suggested she had already had 2. Her smile was beautiful and sharp, the kind that could either open doors or cut glass depending on what side of it you were standing on. The laughter around her swelled. No one in that room, not the senators, not the hedge fund managers, not the socialites in their borrowed diamonds, believed for a single moment that the black handyman with the battered toolbox could do what a team of Swiss specialists had failed to accomplish in 8 months. And that assumption, so casually and completely shared, was about to become the most expensive mistake that ballroom had ever witnessed. The evening had begun the way all of Evelyn Carter's evenings began, with precision, excess, and the kind of quiet authority that came from owning the tallest building in any room she entered. Carter Mansion sat on 14 acres of manicured Connecticut hillside, a stone and glass monument to a century of accumulated power. The fundraiser had been planned for months, a charity gala for the Carter Family Foundation, a cause Evelyn championed publicly and funded privately, one of the few things about her that the gossip columns never managed to twist into something ugly. Invitations had gone to 400 people. 387 had accepted. The caterers had arrived at noon, the florists at 2, and Marcus Johnson had arrived at 8 in the morning, 3 hours before anyone else, because that was the kind of man he was. He had a list, a short one, left by the estate's property manager, a loose cabinet hinge in the east hallway, a bathroom fixture that dripped, a section of crown molding in the library that had buckled from the autumn humidity. Small things. The kind of things that a house of this size generated constantly, the way a river generates ripples. He had been hired through the town's general contracting service 2 weeks earlier, after the previous handyman had retired. He charged fair rates, showed up when he said he would, and never left a job half-finished. That was his entire professional reputation, and it was enough. Marcus had moved through the mansion quietly that morning, addressing each item on the list with a methodical calm that bordered on meditative. He did not rush. He did not take shortcuts. He did not ask for anything he had not been offered. The household staff had noticed him and mostly left him alone, which was exactly what he preferred. It was in the library, while reseating the buckled molding, that he first saw the clock. It sat on a marble pedestal near the center of the room, protected under a bell jar of thick glass, and the moment his eyes landed on it, something shifted in his chest, a recognition so immediate it felt almost like memory. The piece was a double fusee bracket clock, English, almost certainly mid-18th century, with a case of burled walnut and a dial of engraved silver. The escapement was visible through a small aperture in the side panel, and even from across the room, Marcus could see that it was not moving. The clock was silent. He set down his tools and walked closer, careful not to touch, just looking. The mechanism inside was extraordinary, a level of craft that had not existed in any meaningful commercial form for over 200 years. He stood there for nearly 3 minutes, reading the stopped clock the way another man might read a passage of scripture, and then he picked up his toolbox and walked back to the molding without a word to anyone. By 6 in the evening, the mansion had transformed into something out of a magazine spread. The caterers were arranged like a choreographed performance. The flowers had opened to exactly the right degree of bloom, and the guests had begun arriving in a procession of black cars and careful smiles. Marcus finished his last task rehanging a mirror in the east corridor that had been listing slightly to the left and was in the process of packing up his equipment when the first guest who noticed him made his assumption. Known. The man was portly, red-faced, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, and he snapped his fingers twice in Marcus's direction and said, "You, another round of the crab puffs, would you?" Marcus looked at him without expression and said, quietly, "I'm the handyman, sir. The servers are in the blue jackets." The man blinked. Then he made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal, and turned away. 3 minutes later, a woman in a silver dress pointed at Marcus's toolbox and asked if he could take it somewhere less visible, because it was disturbing the aesthetic. He moved it without comment. He had learned, many years ago, that the energy spent on indignation was better directed elsewhere. Evelyn Carter swept through the room at 7:15, pausing to greet guests with the practiced fluency of someone who had grown up doing exactly this. She noticed Marcus near the edge of the foyer, waiting to confirm with the property manager that everything on his list had been completed, and she looked at him the way she looked at most of the service staff, not unkindly exactly, but without the full weight of her attention. He was part of the infrastructure of the evening, like the catering tables and the rented crystal. She signed off on his invoice without reading it and went back to her guests. It was a small dismissal, almost unconscious, and it would take her a long time to forgive herself for it. The evening wore on. The speeches were given. The donations were pledged. The orchestra in the West Room played something that no one was actually listening to. And then, at precisely 8:47, a guest with a fondness for antiques wandered into the library and discovered that the Carter family's most prized heirloom was sitting silent under its bell jar, as dead as a stopped heart. Word traveled through the party the way bad news always does, faster than anyone intended, and with embellishments accumulating at every retelling. By the time it reached Evelyn, the clock had already been described as having crashed and collapsed by two separate guests, neither of whom had actually seen it. She walked into the library, lifted the glass, and looked at the frozen dial with the particular clenched calm of someone who has learned to manage public emotion for the sake of optics. The clock had not crashed. It was not broken in any visible way. It was simply still, which, in some ways, was worse, because the silence of something that had ticked without interruption for over a century felt like a personal accusation. She had done everything right with this house, with this collection, with this legacy, or so she had told herself. Now, 30 or 40 of the most influential people in Connecticut were drifting toward the library doorway with champagne glasses and polite curiosity, and Evelyn Carter was standing over a stopped clock with nothing to say. She mentioned, loudly enough for the room to hear, that she had already engaged 3 specialists, including a team from Geneva, at a combined cost of several $100,000, and not one of them had been able to determine the root cause of the malfunction. She said this with her chin up and her shoulders back, making a failure of engineering sound like a badge of discernment. It was a guest named Frederick Aldridge, a real estate developer, with a humor that landed best when the target was not in the room, who looked out into the foyer, spotted Marcus still waiting near the entrance, and said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear, "Why not let the plumber give it a shot?" The laughter was instant. Not all of it was mean, but none of it was kind. Someone else added something about wrenches and gears. A woman near the door covered her mouth politely, which was somehow worse than if she had simply laughed. Evelyn could have stepped in. She could have redirected the conversation, changed the subject, said something dry and graceful that would have moved the moment along. She did not. Instead, something small and not entirely dignified rose up in her, the reflexive humor of the powerful when confronted with the absurd, and she walked to the library doorway and looked across the foyer at Marcus and said the words that would define the rest of her life. "If you can fix it," she said, clearly and with full awareness of her audience, "I'll marry you." The room erupted. Marcus looked at her across the distance of the foyer, past the laughing guests, past the flickering candlelight, past the invisible wall of class and assumption that separated them, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Are you sure about that?" Evelyn laughed. The room laughed with her. Marcus picked up his toolbox and walked toward the library. The laughter did not stop when he entered the room. If anything, the intimate setting amplified it, the absurdity of the scene, the contrast between the elegantly stopped antique and the man in work clothes setting his tools on the floor beside it. Someone had taken out a phone to record. Marcus did not look at the phone. He lifted the bell jar, set it carefully to one side, and began examining the clock with a focus so complete and so quiet that it created, very gradually, a small pocket of stillness in the room. He did not speak. He did not narrate what he was doing. He simply looked at the dial, at the case, at the aperture where the escapement was visible, running his gaze over each element with the patience of a man who was not performing for anyone. He produced a small magnifying loupe from his toolbox, the kind that watchmakers use, and held it to his eye. He produced a set of micro-tools, slim and precise, arranged in a leather roll that had been worn smooth with use. He opened the side panel of the case with a care that was almost reverent, exposing the mechanism inside. The laughter in the room had thinned, not stopped entirely. There were still a few murmured comments, a few skeptical sniffs, but the texture of the room's attention had changed. People who had been looking at their phones were now looking at Marcus. He worked for 9 minutes. Later, people who had been there would describe it differently. Some said 15 minutes, some said 5, but the estate's security footage, reviewed afterward, would confirm 9 minutes and 42 seconds from the moment Marcus opened the case to the moment the clock began to move. He found the fault in the 3rd minute. A small component in the mainspring assembly had been reseated incorrectly during a previous repair, creating a tension imbalance that had, over time, caused the going train to bind. It was not a flaw in the clock itself. It was a human error, introduced by someone who had been working too fast or with insufficient understanding of this specific mechanism. Marcus made 2 adjustments, with tools so small they were nearly invisible. He checked the escapement, he checked the tension, he closed the side panel, he stood back, and then, in the silence that had somehow descended on that library without anyone noticing it arrive, the clock began to tick. It was not a dramatic sound. It was simply the sound of something returning to what it had always been. A steady, ancient pulse, as natural as breathing. But in that room, among those people, it landed like a thunderclap. Evelyn Carter stared at the moving pendulum and felt something shift in her chest that she would not be able to name for several weeks. No one laughed. The man with the phone lowered it slowly, as if embarrassed by what he had captured. Frederick Aldridge, who had made the initial joke, had gone very quiet, and near the back of the room, almost hidden behind 2 women in floor-length gowns, a man named Dr. Arthur Pemberton, a horologist of some international standing, who had been invited to the gala in his capacity as a board member of the Carter Foundation, was staring at Marcus Johnson with an expression that was not wonder, exactly, but something closer to professional alarm. He recognized the technique. He recognized the specific adjustment Marcus had made to the going train, the particular sequence in which he had addressed the components, the quality of focus that the work required. There was only one institution in the United States where that approach was formally taught, and it was not a trade school. It was not a community college. It was a place where the curriculum had been developed in collaboration with the Horological Institute of Great Britain, and where admission required both a degree in mechanical engineering and a demonstrated aptitude for precision instrument restoration. Arthur Pemberton had lectured there, twice, as a visiting expert. He had never seen a man with a handyman's toolbox work like this. He pushed through the guests toward Marcus and said, before he had fully thought through how the question would sound, "Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus had already begun replacing his tools in their leather roll. He looked up at Dr. Seth Pemberton with the same steady calm that had characterized everything he had done that evening and said, "I had some time to study, once." It was not an evasion, exactly. It was simply an answer that contained much less than the truth, offered without apology or elaboration. Pemberton pressed. The technique, the specific adjustment, the understanding of 18th century English fusee movement dynamics. That was not something a person learned casually. Marcus smiled, not unkindly. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. He closed his toolbox. He said good evening to no one in particular, and he walked out of the library, through the still somewhat stunned foyer, and out the front door of Carter Mansion into the clean October night, leaving behind a room full of people who were, for the first time all evening, genuinely uncertain about something. Evelyn did not sleep well that night. She lay in the master suite of the mansion, a room she had grown up in, a room that knew every version of her, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the clock. Not the clock itself, but the 9 minutes. The absolute absence of performance in those 9 minutes. She had spent her entire adult life in rooms full of people, performing competence, performing authority, performing certainty. She performed them herself, daily, as reflexively as breathing. What she had watched Marcus Johnson do in that library was something else entirely. It was competence that had nothing to prove, moving through a problem without an audience in mind. She thought about what Dr. Pemberton had said to her at the end of the evening, pulling her aside with a gravity that was slightly theatrical but sincerely felt, that whoever this man was, he had been trained at a level that did not correspond with what he appeared to be. Evelyn was not, by nature, a woman who left questions unanswered. By the following morning, she had made a phone call. The person she called was a man named Gregory Holt, who ran a discreet research firm out of a brownstone in Midtown Manhattan. Gregory specialized in the kind of background research that could not be conducted through conventional channels, the kind that required actual human conversations, archival digging, the careful assembly of a life from its scattered paper trails. She gave him Marcus Johnson's name, approximate age, and the town of his current employment. She told Gregory she needed a full picture within the week. Gregory, who had worked for Evelyn's father before her, asked no questions. He delivered in 4 days. Evelyn read the report on a Tuesday morning, seated at the desk in her library, with the now ticking clock visible on its pedestal across the room. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window for a long time. Marcus Darnell Johnson, born 40 years ago in Bridgeport, Connecticut, had graduated summa cum laude from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a degree in mechanical engineering at the age of 21. He had gone directly into graduate study at the same institution, earning a doctorate in precision systems engineering 4 years later. At 27, he had co-founded a technology company called Meridian Systems, which had developed a proprietary class of micro-actuator components for use in aerospace applications. The company had grown quickly, attracting significant venture capital, and eventually landing a series of defense and commercial contracts that put it on the short list of the most promising small-cap engineering firms in the country. Marcus had served as chief technical officer. By his early 30s, his personal net worth had been, on paper, substantial. And then, over the course of about 18 months, everything had stopped. The company had been restructured following a dispute among the founding partners. Gregory's report was careful and specific about this. The dispute had involved a deliberate misappropriation of intellectual property by one of Marcus's co-founders, a betrayal of the most personal and professional kind, conducted with legal precision and executed without warning. Marcus had fought it through 2 years of litigation and lost not because he was wrong, but because his opponent had resources he did not, and the legal system, as it so often does, had sided with the larger checkbook. Around the same time, his mother had died. The two events had arrived in the same season, and between them, they had apparently done something to Marcus Johnson's relationship with the life he had built that could not be undared by time or therapy or anything else Gregory could find a record of. He had quietly divested the remaining assets he controlled, settled in a small town in Connecticut, obtained a general contractor's license, and begun doing handyman work. He had lived that way for 6 years. He had not given a single interview. He had not attended a single industry event. He had not, as far as Gregory could determine, told anyone who he was. Evelyn put the report in a drawer and did not open it again that week. But she thought about it constantly, not the facts of it exactly, but the shape of it, the specific gravity of a man who had achieved everything the world said mattered, and then walked away from it not because he had failed, but because he had been failed, and had decided, somewhere in the wreckage, that the world which had done that to him was not one he needed to impress. She thought about Victor Lang. Victor was 48, the founder and managing partner of Lang Capital, and he had been pursuing an acquisition of Carter Holdings for the better part of 3 years. He was charming in the particular way of men who have decided that charm is a business tool, and he had made his interest in Evelyn, personally known in ways that she had deflected with professionalism that cost her more energy than she let on. He had been at the gala. He had watched the scene with the clock, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he had said to her afterward, very quietly, that she needed to be more careful about the staff she let near her family's heirlooms. She had not said what she wanted to say, because there were cameras and donors in the room, and Evelyn Carter had been managing herself in public since she was 12 years old. It was Victor who had led the conversation that turned ugliest. He had found Marcus near the exit later that evening, after the clock incident, in what might have appeared to an onlooker as a casual conversation between two men. But those nearby heard the edges of it, the particular cadence of a man using words as weapons while maintaining the plausible deniability of pleasantry. Victor had commented on Marcus's work clothes, on his toolbox, on what he called the limits of manual labor, in a tone that was silk over gravel. He had said something about how certain jobs were well suited to certain types, a phrasing so deliberately vague that it could be denied if challenged, but landed with total precision on its intended target. Marcus had said nothing throughout this. He had stood and listened and let it finish. When Victor walked away, satisfied with the impact he had made, Marcus turned and found Evelyn standing 4 feet behind him, having heard most of it. She expected anger. She expected him to say something to her in confrontation or complaint or appeal. Instead, he looked at her calmly and said goodnight, as if the conversation with Victor had been about the weather, and walked to his truck. Evelyn stood in the driveway for a moment after the taillights disappeared. Then she went back inside and spent the rest of the evening feeling, without entirely understanding why, ashamed. She called him the next morning. Not through the contracting service, but directly. She had taken his personal number from the invoice. She told him there were a few more items on the property that needed attention, which was true. He arrived at 9. They worked around each other for most of the morning without speaking about anything of significance. Around 11, she brought coffee to the kitchen, where he was reinforcing a section of cabinetry that had been poorly installed during a renovation years earlier. She set a cup near him and said, without preamble, "Why didn't you say anything to him last night?" Marcus looked at the cup, then at her. "Because what he said doesn't define me," he said, and responding to it would have given him the satisfaction of knowing he could make me react. Evelyn considered this. "Most people would have reacted," she said. "Most people let other people choose their emotional state for them," he said. "I stopped doing that a long time ago." She wanted to ask what that meant, what had happened, what the long road looked like from the inside, but she was still too much herself, still too accustomed to the armor of indirection, to ask anything that direct. So she said nothing more about it, and they drank their coffee, and the cabinet work got done, and she watched him pack up his tools with the odd feeling that something in the room had shifted in a direction she had not chosen. The crisis came on a Friday. The mansion's central electrical system, a sophisticated integrated grid that managed lighting, security, HVAC, and the backup generators that kept the estate's climate-controlled storage facilities running, went down at 2 in the afternoon, not gradually, all at once. The timing could not have been worse. There was a dinner that evening for 12 members of the Carter Foundation's board, and in the climate-controlled wing, there were pieces of art and documents that could not sustain more than a few hours of fluctuating temperature without risk. The estate's property manager called the electrical contractor. The electrical contractor said he could not get anyone there before Monday. The property manager called the emergency line of the secondary contractor. No answer. She called Evelyn, who was already in the car on her way back from the city. And Evelyn, without entirely thinking it through, called Marcus. He answered on the second ring and arrived within 20 minutes. He moved through the electrical systems with the same methodical quiet he brought to everything, but there was an additional quality to it now, something that Evelyn, watching from the hallway, eventually identified as systematic diagnostic thinking. He was not troubleshooting by intuition. He was working through the system architecturally, ruling out possibilities in a specific sequence, narrowing the field with each check. It took him 40 minutes to find the fault, and when he found it, he went very still. He called Evelyn into the utility room and showed her, without dramatic emphasis, what he had found. It was not a failure of equipment. It was not a blown fuse or a deteriorated cable or anything that age or use might reasonably explain. A specific junction in the primary distribution panel had been manually altered, not damaged, not worn out, but deliberately and carefully reconfigured in a way that would appear random to anyone not looking very closely. Someone had been inside this panel within the last 48 hours and had induced the failure on purpose. Marcus said this quietly, and with the same absence of theatrical emphasis that characterized everything he said. Evelyn looked at what he was showing her and felt a cold, specific dread settle in her stomach. She thought of the board meeting. She thought of the art in the climate-controlled wing. She thought of Victor Lang, who had been a guest in this house 11 days ago and who had maneuvered himself near every restricted area of the property, with a smoothness she had registered at the time and dismissed. Marcus repaired the fault in under an hour. The power came back on at 4:15, with enough time to restore the climate systems, reset the security protocols, and prepare for the evening's dinner as though nothing had happened. The board members arrived to a house in perfect order. No one outside the household knew what had occurred. But Evelyn knew, and over the following 10 days, as she quietly gathered documentation access logs, security footage fragments, the timeline of Victor's recent moves against Carter Holdings in the financial markets, the picture that assembled itself was both clearer and darker than she had initially feared. Victor had been accumulating short positions against Carter Holdings stock for months, positioning himself to profit substantially from a drop in the company's share price. The gala, the clock incident, the electrical sabotage, these were not random events. They were pressure points, chosen for their visibility and their timing, designed to create an impression of a company whose infrastructure was crumbling and whose leadership was struggling. He wanted the board to lose confidence in Evelyn. He wanted the institutional investors to get nervous. He wanted her, ultimately, to sell to him at the distressed valuation that his machinations had engineered. It was a patient, precise, and genuinely sophisticated strategy. And Marcus Johnson, in the span of one Friday afternoon, had pulled its most critical thread. She told him all of this on a Saturday evening, sitting on the back terrace of the mansion, with the Connecticut hills going dark in layers around them. She had not planned to tell him so much. She had not planned to sit there for 3 hours. She had not planned to talk about her father, or about the years after his death, or about the specific loneliness of being very wealthy and very visible, and never entirely certain whether the people around you were drawn to you or to your balance sheet. But Marcus was a good listener in the particular way that people are who do not feel the need to fill silence with themselves, and the night was calm, and the words came easier than she expected. She told him about the report Gregory had compiled on his history, and she watched his face as she did. He was not angry. He was not particularly surprised. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said simply, "Your father was a good man." She had not expected that. "You knew him?" she said. "He knew my mother," Marcus said. "When I was 11, she worked in the Carter Foundation offices for a few years. When she got sick the first time, he made sure she had health coverage that the standard employee plan didn't provide. He never told her why. I didn't put it together until much later." Evelyn looked at him in the dark for a long time. "He never mentioned it," she said. "He wouldn't have," Marcus said. "That's the kind of man he was." The annual shareholders' meeting for Carter Holdings was held on a Thursday in mid-November, in the conference room of the company's Hartford headquarters. The agenda was routine. The atmosphere was not. Victor Lang had been quietly consolidating support among the institutional shareholders for the better part of a year, and he arrived that morning with enough proxies to put forward a motion of no confidence in Evelyn's leadership, the first step in a process that would, if successful, open the door to the hostile acquisition he had been working toward. His legal team was present. His communications advisors were present. He had, by most counts, the votes he needed. The meeting was called to order. The preliminary business was concluded. Victor rose to present his motion, with the fluid confidence of a man who has already rehearsed the victory. And then the door at the back of the room opened, and Marcus Johnson walked in, dressed in a dark suit that fit him the way experience fits a person, without effort, without announcement, and sat down at the table. The room went quiet in a different way than rooms went quiet around Marcus. This was not the quiet of confusion or amusement. This was the quiet of something being fundamentally reconsidered. Victor's lawyer leaned to him and said something in a low voice. Victor's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The share registry had been reviewed that morning, as it always was before a contested shareholders' meeting, but the share register for closely held companies like Carter Holdings is not always immediately current, and certain transfers that had been processed over the preceding weeks through a series of intermediary holding structures had not yet been fully consolidated in the summary document. Marcus had been a shareholder of Carter Holdings for 7 years. His initial investment, made shortly after his departure from Meridian Systems, had been modest. A gesture of gratitude toward a company whose founder had shown his mother a kindness. An investment made quietly and with no expectation of recognition. But Marcus Johnson, for all that he had chosen a life of deliberate simplicity, had never stopped understanding the mechanics of financial instruments. And over 7 years, through a series of reinvestments and secondary purchases that had been executed with characteristic patience and precision, his stake had grown to a figure that was, at this specific moment, in this specific room, exactly sufficient to block Victor's motion. Not reverse it, not overwhelm it, simply stop it. Victor tried 3 things in rapid succession. He challenged the validity of the share transfers, he questioned the timeline of the registrations, and he requested an adjournment. All 3 were overruled by the meeting's independent chair, who had reviewed the documentation in advance. The motion was put to the floor. It failed. Victor Lang sat down. The rest of the meeting proceeded in the quiet, procedural manner of business that has been settled. Afterward, in the marble lobby of the Hartford headquarters, as Victor's team filed out with the particular suppressed energy of a group that has rehearsed a celebration and must now redirect it, Marcus stood near the window and watched the street below. Evelyn found him there. She did not have a speech prepared. She had spent the previous night trying to draft one and had discarded every version because they all sounded like gratitude, and gratitude felt insufficient. She said his name. He turned. She said, "You've been protecting this company for 7 years." He looked at her steadily. "Your father protected my family," he said. "The math isn't complicated. It is to me," she said. And for the first time since they had met, she did not have anything else to add. The investigation into Victor Lang's activities was opened by the Securities and Exchange Commission within 6 weeks of the shareholders' meeting, initiated in part by a detailed filing submitted by Carter Holdings' legal team, documenting the pattern of market manipulation and the physical sabotage of the Carter estate's electrical infrastructure. Victor retained 4 lawyers and said nothing publicly. His short positions were frozen, pending the outcome of the investigation. His investors began requesting redemptions. By the new year, Lang Capital had suspended operations. It was not a spectacular collapse, it happened quietly. In the way that things built on the exploitation of other people's trust tend to eventually fail, not with a bang, but with an accumulation of unpayable accounts. Evelyn did not celebrate when she heard. She had moved past the part of herself that celebrated other people's failures. She was too busy with what came next. The gala the following spring was held at Carter Mansion on an evening that smelled like hyacinths and new grass, and the particular kind of beginning that you only recognize in retrospect. The Carter Foundation had surpassed its annual fundraising goal for the first time in 4 years. The board was aligned. The institutional investors were back. Evelyn stood at the front of the great room in a dress, the color of late afternoon light, and said the things she was supposed to say: "Thank you, and the mission matters, and your generosity is what makes this possible," and meant every word of them, which was not always the case at these events. She was better at this than she had been a year ago. More honest, more open, less armored. People in the room who had known her for a long time had noticed it without quite being able to name it. Something had changed in her. Something had loosened. When the formal portion of the evening concluded, and the room relaxed into conversation and music, and the particular ease of people who have just done something good together. Evelyn found herself near the center of the room, with a champagne glass she wasn't drinking from, and she looked across the crowd to where Marcus was standing, not with a toolbox this time, but with a glass of his own, talking to Dr. Arthur Pemberton, who had become, over the intervening months, something like a friend to both of them. She walked to him. The room was full and warm and loud enough that the conversation was private. She said, "I've been thinking about something I said to you last October." Marcus looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had come to think of as his signature entirely present, without a trace of performance. "I said some cruel things last October," she said. "More than one. But there was a specific one." He waited. "I made a joke," she said, "in front of a lot of people, at your expense, about something that should never be a joke." She looked at her champagne glass and then back at him. "I've thought about it 100 times since then. I know why I did it. I was performing for the room, and you were convenient, and I didn't think of you as a person I could hurt. That was wrong in every way a thing can be wrong, and I'm sorry." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Around them, the party continued. "I know you are," he said. "I knew it before you said it." She looked at him. "That doesn't mean it didn't need saying," she said. "No," he agreed. "It didn't." A beat of silence, and then Evelyn smiled, a real one, the kind she did not deploy publicly very often. "I also said that if you fixed it, I'd marry you." Marcus smiled back. "I remember." "So do I," she said. "I've been thinking about whether that should still stand." She reached into the small evening bag she was carrying and produced something that made the people nearest to her go quiet, and then the quiet spread outward through the room, the way the striking of a clock face spreads the awareness of time in rings, gradually, until the whole room was watching. It was a ring, not ostentatious, but unmistakable. She held it between her fingers and looked at Marcus and said, clearly and without trembling, "I know this is not how it's supposed to go. I know I'm not supposed to be the one asking. I know there are 100 reasons this is strange, and 100 more reasons why what I said last year was terrible, and you should say no just on principle." She paused. "But I have spent the last 12 months watching you be the most quietly extraordinary person I have ever met, and I would like, if you are willing, to spend considerably more time doing that." The room was completely still. Someone near the back had raised a phone, but in a different spirit than the phone raised in the library 12 months ago, not to capture a failure, but to witness something. Marcus looked at the ring. He looked at Evelyn. He looked around the room for a moment, at the faces of people who had, in various ways, underestimated both of them. He looked back at her. "I'm willing," he said. There was no dramatic gesture, no speech, no performance for the crowd. He took the ring from her hand and held it, and the room erupted in the kind of sound that only happens when something real has just occurred in front of a lot of people. In the library, on its marble pedestal, the Carter family's double fusee bracket clock ticked steadily in the empty room. It had not stopped once in the 12 months since Marcus had set it right. It kept its count through the parties and the crises and the long, quiet evenings and the moments that could not be photographed because they were too true for that: the coffee in the kitchen, the terrace in the dark, the conversations that had slowly assembled themselves into something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed. A clock does not know the difference between time that is wasted and time that is well spent. It simply counts. But the people who listen to it, if they are paying attention, are the ones who get to decide what they do with what it gives them. Marcus Johnson had understood that for a long time. Evelyn Carter was learning it. And the clock, as it always had, kept going. There is a particular kind of dignity that belongs to people who do not announce themselves, who carry their knowledge and their history quietly, who show up where they are needed and do the work and leave without requiring acknowledgement. The world tends to notice these people late, if at all, because it is largely organized around the preferences of those who are loudest and richest and most certain of their own importance. Victor Lang had understood this, or thought he had, and had used the world's inattention to quieter people as a weapon. He had been wrong. He had looked at a man with a worn toolbox and seen a convenient target. He had not looked closely enough to see the mind behind the stillness, or the history behind the calm, or the years of patient and deliberate choices that had been building, without fanfare, toward exactly this moment. He had made the oldest mistake that power makes, which is to confuse visibility with worth and silence with weakness. Marcus Johnson had never been weak. He had simply been choosing, every single day, to spend his strength on things that mattered. Evelyn Carter spent a long time learning to see past the surfaces she had been trained, from childhood, to read as the whole story. She was not a bad person before Marcus. She was a person shaped by her inheritance, not just of money, but of assumptions, of the particular blindness that comes with growing up surrounded by people who confirm your worldview because it benefits them to do so. The best thing that happened to Evelyn in the year that changed her life was not the shareholders' meeting or the resolution of the Lang Capital investigation, or even the ring on her left hand on a spring evening in a room full of people who had gathered in good faith for a good purpose. The best thing that happened to her was 9 minutes and 42 seconds in a library in October, watching a man she had just publicly humiliated fix a clock with the unhurried attention of someone who had nothing to prove. That 9 minutes cracked something open in her, not gently, and not all at once, but permanently. She had grown up believing that competence announced itself, that real accomplishment came with a resume and a press release and evaluation. She had been, in this belief, wrong in a way that her education and her social world had conspired to prevent her from discovering. One man with a toolbox, on an autumn evening, with no audience in mind and no performance to give, had shown her something about the relationship between ability and humility that she would spend the rest of her life trying to live up to. And so they went forward, the two of them, out of that ballroom, out of that year of fire and revelation, into the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a shared life. They were not without difficulty. They came from different worlds in ways that a single year of transformation could not entirely bridge. There were moments of miscommunication, of old habits resurfacing, of the particular friction that arises when two people, who are both, in their different ways, extremely capable of managing their own emotions, try to learn to stop managing and start trusting. But they had, between them, something that is rarer than most people realize: a shared commitment to showing up honestly, to doing the work that needed doing without keeping score, to not performing for each other when it would have been easier to. Marcus brought to their life together a steadiness that Evelyn found she did not merely admire, but relied on, not as a crutch, but as a compass. She brought to his a re-engagement with the world. He had stepped back from not the world of wealth and power as he had known it, but the world of building things, of applying the extraordinary capabilities he had carried quietly, for 6 years, to purposes larger than a cabinet hinge or a bathroom fixture. He did not return to the corporate life. He had no desire to. But he and Evelyn together began funding a mechanical engineering scholarship through the Carter Foundation for students from underrepresented backgrounds, first-generation college students, the people that institutions, like the one he had attended, tended to admit in small numbers and support in smaller ones still. It was a quiet initiative, without a press release. The first 2 recipients were notified by letter. Marcus wrote the letters himself. The clock ticked on. And that, in the end, is what clocks do. They do not reward or punish, do not applaud or condemn. They simply mark the passage of time and leave it to the people listening to decide what has been worth it. In that library, on its pedestal, the Carter family's 250-year-old double-fusee bracket clock kept perfect time through the seasons that followed through the winter of the investigation and the spring of the Carter family's proposal and the summer of the small, private wedding that no photographer was invited to, and the years after, which belonged only to the people living them. One man had heard it fall silent and known, without being asked what was needed, not because it was his job, not because anyone would thank him for it, but because he understood, in a way that could not be taught in any formal sense but only lived into, that the things worth keeping alive are worth the care they require, and that the most important repairs, in the end, are never the mechanical ones. There is a story that gets told, sometimes, about the night of the gala, about the clock, and the toolbox, and the 10 minutes that silenced a room. It travels the way good stories do, picking up details it was never given, and losing others it should have kept. In some versions, Marcus makes a speech. In others, Evelyn apologizes in front of the entire party, rather than months later, in a quieter and more honest moment. In nearly all of the versions, something important is missing, which is the plainness of it. The truth of that October evening was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. There was no music swelling at the right moment, no perfect lighting that caught everyone from the most flattering angle. There was a man doing his work. There was a room that had decided he could not. There was the clock, and then the silence, and then the ticking. And somewhere in that sequence, something real had happened that no version of the story could improve upon, because the reality of it was already more than enough. That is the version worth keeping. Not the one with the speeches, but the one with the 9 minutes. Not the one where anyone announces what they have learned, but the one where a man sets down his loop and closes the side panel of an old clock and stands back and lets the work speak entirely for itself because he has never needed it to say anything else. The scholarship recipients, in the years that followed, were never told the origin story in full. They received their letters and their award notifications and the practical support of a foundation that paid attention to what they actually needed rather than what looked best in an annual report. Some of them went on to remarkable careers. Some of them went on to quiet ones. All of them had been seen, which is the thing that matters most, and costs the least, and is somehow still the rarest gift one person can give another. Marcus understood this because he had spent the years of his invisibility learning it from the inside. Evelyn understood it because she had spent 1 year watching someone live it with a completeness that embarrassed her old assumptions into silence. Together, in their different ways, and at different speeds, they had arrived at the same conviction, that the measure of a life is not what it accumulates, but what it repairs, what it finds broken, tends to carefully, and leaves running steadily for whoever comes next.